Okay, before we get to our final bonus questions, um, I'd like to ask you about the Bruce Gilley affair. Now, he's a colleague of yours who takes a similar but not identical view on empire, and he actually goes as far as arguing that there's a case for colonialism today. And he had an article which was retracted under because the editor of the relevant journal faced death threats, and I think he's been disinvited from various speeches and things. So, what do you make of his argument that there's a case for colonialism today?
So Bruce's article, "The Case for Colonialism," is really what inspired uh, me to write my book. So I owe Bruce a lot. Um, and in his article, I mean, there are two things he argues. One is that colonialism was sometimes a lot better than people think it was, and he cites in aid Chinua Achebe, the famous novelist and African nationalist, who, on the eve of his death in 2013, was being pressed by Iranian journalists to condemn the British Empire, and he refused. He said it's complicated. The British Empire comprised both good and bad, or good as well as bad. So that was one of his theses, which I entirely agree with. He also suggested that we should get over our allergic reaction to the idea of weaker states being aided by stronger states. And so he was not arguing, as some people who haven't bothered to read his article and just have reacted against the title, he was not arguing for a return of 19th century European colonialism. What he was arguing for was that some states whose governments are weak in certain respects, maybe through corruption or incompetence or whatever it is, would benefit from having a strong, well-ordered state come along and take over, with consent, certain parts of their government in order to reform it and generate the right kind of culture. And he gave certain examples of where that had happened. The Chinese, who were never colonized, employed Europeans sometimes to run parts of their own government. So that was his argument. I agree with it. I agree with both parts entirely. And when I read the article, first of all, I read it twice just to make sure I could believe what I'd read. And I said to myself, "This is explosive, but it's not stupid." And I think actually Bruce is right. I mean, Bruce is a robust Western Canadian who tends to speak with fewer qualifications than I do. But basically, I agree with him.
So, how would that work then? Because if we take, say, some of the countries that are more dysfunctional and corrupt in sub-Saharan Africa, part of the reason that they have those characteristics is that the current government is not doing a very good job and doesn't and puts the interests of itself and its loyalists above general welfare. So, how would you convince people that are already engaged in patronage to relinquish some of the power they have and bestow it on supposedly public-minded European bureaucrats?
Yes, good point. I mean, only international pressure. I think of the UN, but then or maybe international institutions, economic institutions, could apply pressure to governments to either reform themselves or accept reform. And I guess the IMF and other institutions like it will lay down conditions for making loans, for example. So you can do it that way.
Or maybe just bribe them. Like, say, we'll give you a certain number of dollars if you get out of the way and let us run the government for a few years.
Well, that's another way of doing it. And speaking as an ethicist, it might be justified to do it. I mean, obviously the way in which Europeans in the 19th century did it, namely landing in territories and imposing government. We're not going to repeat that now, partly because of issues of consent. Although, having said that, I mean, oftentimes colonial government did have various kinds of consent, and indeed the numbers of Britons on the ground were so small that it couldn't have survived without widespread local buy-in of some of various kinds. But we're not going to do that. When we have recently gone into the likes of Iraq and Afghanistan, in the first case to replace a government. Now, there was no intention of British and Americans, Europeans running Iraq directly. The idea was always to install an Iraqi government and then support it. And in Afghanistan, there was no. I guess we did help to displace the Taliban government, and then sought to shore up its democratic successor. Now, in both cases, in my view, the intentions were right. In the Iraqi case, the execution was badly flawed. In Afghanistan, and again, I think the intentions were good, and I think the withdrawal was probably a big mistake. But the point is this, that the business of trying to reform other people's governments is very costly in terms of money and in terms of sometimes of lives. And if you're going to do it, your own national interest has to be centrally involved, because it's going to take a long time. And we were in Iraq for 15 years, and Afghanistan for about 20. That's a pretty long time. But it would have taken longer to bed down some of the reforms. And so the lessons I draw from Iraq and Afghanistan is that it's not always wrong to intervene for humanitarian purposes, even militarily. But if you're going to do it, be aware of the complexity of the problem, and be aware it's going to take a long time. And if you're going to sustain that domestically, then the national interest has to be centrally engaged in a way it wasn't in Afghanistan or Iraq.